Time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all.
Good morning.
Al, given that this is our last podcast from Fromm and Fuller in 2021, it seems like this would be a perfect time for a long view question. And frankly, the one that comes to mind for many Americans and for me personally is about the future of democracy in the United States. Perhaps 5 or 6 years ago, this kind of question simply wouldn't have been on the list. But now almost every day we see serious signs that our country's system of government is in trouble. And that includes more information about how close the government came to a coup by the Trump administration, but also things like a recent poll that suggests that 30% of registered Republicans agree with the statement that true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. Well, the list goes on, but you and Craig have been witness to our system of government at the front row for almost half a century. Are we really that much in trouble?
Well, I think we're probably in trouble, but the truth is we're always in trouble because democracy is fragile, and we often have to, in one way or another, fight to protect it. I mean, we always have a crisis in this country. We had the Great Depression in the 1930s. We had the rise of Hitler, and faced by isolationism in this country. And Roosevelt had to go around Congress to help our future allies in Europe. Then we had World War II. We had McCarthyism. You talk about violence in the 1960s. We had a president assassinated, a United States senator assassinated, and probably one of the most important civilian leaders in our country, Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated as well. You had riots in 30 or 40 American cities. There's a lot of violence, a lot of deaths. The country was split in half over a war in Vietnam. And then in the 1970s, we had the Watergate scandal and the government fell. Now, whenever you're in a crisis like we are, and when you have an event like January 6th, it always seems a lot worse than because it's in the present and you don't know how it's going to work out. And this is a very serious crisis. But if you think about the election of 2020, our institutions did work. Our federalism system proved to be genius because the president, who would have done anything he could on his own, as we're finding out, to steal his reelection, he couldn't do it because the power of elections was not with the federal government, but in the states, and even in states controlled by Republicans, our local officials stood up and while it wasn't pretty and it certainly was not a very good sight on Inauguration Day, we did have a peaceful transfer of power. That coup failed. Joe Biden's the president, and Trump, for all his noise, is pretty much isolated in Florida. He still has political power, but I think Craig and I would both agree that it is slowly diminishing. And now the January 6th committee and the law are closing in on him. He might not have a very good 2022. Now, we still have this, I think the greatest danger we face is the threat of state legislators and legislatures undermining the election. That's not unprecedented. Believe it or not, we've had that happen before. And I must say the outcome of that was not particularly great. In 1876, we had a disputed election where Samuel Tilden, remember President Tilden, Tilden won a majority of the popular vote. He won the electoral vote by 19 votes, but 3 states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, which composed 20 electoral votes, withheld their votes because both parties sent electors claiming to be victorious. The outcome was we had a compromise. This election was decided politically by the leaders. We had the compromise of 1877, which put the loser, Rutherford B. Hayes, loser of the election, as president. But in return, the Democrats, who are still a major Southern party, got troops pulled out of the South, got some railroads built, got the right to control their elections, which meant the Jim Crow era. So that, it took us basically 100 years until the 1960s to undo a lot of the damage that election did. So yes, now, but we're also, it's similar to them. The problem, the issue there was really the emergence of Black voters as a power force, particularly in the South. And the South wanted to prevent it, and they made the deal to prevent it. Today, we also have a period of rapid demographic change, and we're going to have a change in power arrangements coming. In the broadly, for all of our history, basically, white, Christian-oriented, Christian-Jewish-oriented power structure has controlled the direction of the United States. But we're rapidly becoming a majority-minority country. And what we're going through now are efforts to adapt to that, to become the first multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. We talked about that a little bit throughout the year. Trump and January 6th are the resistors, because they see their hegemony threatened. And because the Republican Party also, I think wrongly, because I think they could compete, but believes that their power is threatened, they at least temporarily have joined in the resistance. But we've got big problems, and but what America needs, I think now, and what I think it will get, is a new generation of leadership. Out of this country, when we've been in trouble before, we've had great governors emerge. Think about Franklin Roosevelt. Think about Reagan. Think about Bill Clinton, all coming out of the States and all changing the direction of American politics. I suspect if we look back in a couple of years, maybe things will be even worse than they are now, but I suspect we'll see, the Trump forces diminished. I guess I've always predicted that, but the forces of the law are closing in. And I think we will begin to see some new leaders coming from the country. Sometimes you don't know where they're going to come from, but it's been our history, and I'm optimistic that it will continue to be our future.
Craig, do you agree with all that? I mean, do you feel like this is kind of overblown, and that the Trump effort at the end of last year was very easily folded?
Well, there's much of what Al said I agree with, and I think the historical perspective is an important one. I was reflecting on this and trying to think about how to discuss it, and I think I want to do a little bit more from a personal perspective, and on 2 tracks. One, the whole question of democracy, and I've spent a little time this year, for one reason or another, reading books about the founding fathers and some of the things they were going through. And to me, that's almost the high watermark of profound focus, almost obsession on democracy and creating a governing process and a governing system that would last, and it has lasted. But if that's the high watermark, one of the things that I think saddens me is that I don't think the large majority of Americans are nearly as focused on the importance of democracy. I think that's one of the reasons why, for those of us who've been involved maybe more in government, who were so appalled by what happened on January 6th, others kind of want to move on and didn't see it as the highly unusual moment in our history that threatens democracy. But that alone doesn't mean that somehow the nation is adrift. I think that I always like the phrase that democracy as a form of government isn't perfect. It's just the best system available, particularly for our country, if not for all countries, but particularly for our country. And I think, as Al suggested, we're constantly improving and perfecting, and we're finding leaders when we need them. And I too think they're out there. I think they're out there in the states. I think they will emerge. I do think Trump is diminishing in importance, and some of the polling, to be honest with you, I'm not sure we're using polling in the wisest way. If you ask people if they've ever had an encounter with an extraterrestrial, you get a high percentage, surprisingly high percentage of people that claim they have. The question about violence, I mean, that's a kind of, pardon the pun, but two-edged sword. I mean, I might say, as much as I abhorred violence, that we may have violence to put down, uprisings. And so the assumption is, if you think there's going to be violence in the future, that you somehow are a proponent of violence, which I am not. But on the democracy front, I do think we have to be attentive and realize that this is something very precious. And if I don't think it's really at risk of being lost, but I do think in order to make it work better for all Americans, we have to be attentive to it. On another track, though, but related, I think if Americans are less interested in democracy and in what happens in Washington, D.C., and maybe even state houses, in part it's because they feel kind of detached from it. It doesn't affect their lives. And on that note, I kind of thought about the year, and I thought, sure, there's a lot of issues, a lot of political issues. The media is riveted, to the problems day in and day out, hour by hour, minute by minute. But the latest job statistics have, more people back at work in every category except retail, I think, was off a little bit. But jobs are the fundamentally most important factor in, I think, people's sense of well-being and being able to provide for themselves and their family. And jobs are coming back. On another level, people are finding they can work where they reside. They can spend more time with their family. They can create a life balance situation for themselves at all economic levels that is better for them, healthier for them. We've come out of this COVID crisis with a whole new realization of how work and living can maybe be put in different balance. Out here where I live, and it's not limited too much by economics. You have people, boating, people getting into boating at all levels. You have more people flying. You have people who want to travel. You have more people buying pets and enjoying. I've got 3 dogs. You've got more. Lifestyle issues are, I think, far more positive than what we see in the press. And I go back at a time, I went to college out at UCLA, 1969 to 1973, where colleges around us were shutting down. We shut down for a few days because of the Vietnam War and protests, and people extraordinarily angry with their government. And later only found out that, of course, our government wasn't necessarily telling us the truth, not in one administration, but through multiple administrations. And that, I think, was a huge threat in some ways to our democracy. And we came out of that. So I'm going to finish kind of where Al did. I do think the times cry out for stronger leaders, cry out for people who are provide balance and, come into public office with the desire to make things better and get things done. And I suspect that over time that's going to emerge. I do think we have to give it time. And I think the cable news, this constant pounding of negative stories, and I've never been a person to bash the press. I just think the constant pounding of this news is troubling, which, by the way, is why people are simply stop watching some of these programs in record numbers and turn to other forms of news and information like The Spy. So I think we'll get through this. I think that there are some troubled times ahead. I do hope that people will realize that more attention being paid to democracy and their government is a very good thing, especially as we enter an election year. But I suspect that most of them will keep living their life as best they can and enjoying, as has often been said, the fruits of their labor to the full extent they can.
Dave, I just want to say that as we discuss this stuff every day, and as Craig and I have been through fights throughout our time in politics, I'm always reminded of something President Clinton told me when he was Governor Clinton, when he was that emerging leader, and I think in 1990, and we were getting our heads bashed in because we were trying to change the Democratic Party and end the losing streak. And he just looked at me and he said, change is never easy. And this is a period of enormous change. Craig talked about cable TV. I mean, we now have a generation of politicians, and mostly on the extremes of both parties, and a lot worse on the the extremes are a lot worse on the Republican side, in my view, but who these people in Congress really aren't in Congress to be in Congress. They're in Congress to be on social media, to be on cable TV. That's their base. Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't have any responsibilities in Congress, and she's the biggest money raiser in the Republican Party. AOC lives represents a district where there's water in the subways, and she votes against the infrastructure bill because neither of them, their constituencies really aren't their constituents. And this is all, we'll work all this out over time. But the demographic change that is coming in the country is so enormous. My father was an immigrant, and he told me stories about how hard it was, growing up as a kid when he came over to South Bend, Indiana, and the resistance that that he and our family had. But it works, but one of the great things about our system, it has been flexible enough to work its way, these problems work their way out. I think one of the things that we may have to figure out is because of the way the growth has come, and it's uneven growth, and so much of the economic growth is in big metropolitan areas. We may have to figure out how we adjust some of the institutions of democracy to catch up with the new population patterns. And that will also be a brutal fight, but I have no doubt that in the end, we'll figure it out.
Craig, you have the last word.
Well, I'm going to choose somebody for the last word that comes from Great Britain. I was reminded as we were having this discussion of Margaret Thatcher, who came here when things were turning downward. George Herbert Walker Bush was president. I think it was in the course of an interview where she was being asked one negative question after another, and she finally turned to the camera and said, "Look, America, buck up. Things are pretty darn good here. The rest of the world is looking to you for leadership, and things are a lot better than you're giving yourself credit for." And I think maybe those words ring true today in many respects. I do think we have to continue to find people who not only lead, but also appear and in fact are relevant and understand the needs of the nation. I'm pretty confident those people are out there, and hope they will emerge sooner rather than later. Everybody enjoy the holidays, and we all wish you a very happy New Year.
Well, Craig Fuller, Al Fromm, happy holidays as well, and we'll see you in the next year.